Good morning, everyone. Welcome as you start coming on in. I know it's not our normal day. It's a Tuesday. We're doing intelligent masculinity today. Hey, y'all. I'm Nick Paro, not your dad, joined by Jasper Craven, author of the book God Forgives, Brothers Don't, which is going to be a main part of our discussion today. Which, as I introduced last week when I said we had to push our episode back, is I'll give the Simon and Schuster little bit of a brief mention on the book. Is in the tradition of Sebastian Junger's Tribe and Chris Hedges' classic War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, a powerful investigation into the fraught history and ominous future of military education in the United States and how it formed and fuels increasingly volatile strains of American masculinity. So, Jasper, welcome. Do you mind introducing yourself? Because this is going to be a really good discussion today. We're going to have a lot to talk about masculinity, the history of American masculinity, the history of an American ideal or twisted version of toxicity in our masculinity, and how we got here, what it might look like going forward, and how do we face it. So, Jasper, do you mind introducing yourself to everybody as they start coming on in? And I say hi in our audience. Good morning.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me, Nick, and appreciate everybody tuning in. My name is Jasper Craven. I am an investigative journalist covering veterans and the military for outlets including Harper's Magazine, The New Yorker, The New York Times, Task and Purpose, Warhorse, etc. I've been on this beat really since about 2014. When I was a stringer in Washington, D.C., covering the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee. And that summer, there was a wait time scandal at a VA hospital in Phoenix. And so I was sort of thrust into this, social safety net supporting returning veterans and sort of its many programs and challenges and also accomplishments. I think a lot of people on this beat many are vets themselves. I am not. But many sort of start first with, Pentagon reporting, either embedding in war zones or covering, defense matters in Virginia. And I sort of took the opposite route instead, rather than sort of starting with like the active duty world, really enmeshed myself in the world of veterans. And through that, covered GI Bill issues, healthcare, veteran homelessness, lots of things. But I think I got a sense too of the sort of, less tangible ideas that motivated veterans to serve and sort of how those often were and were not completely validated. I would often ask vets at the beginning of interviews why they joined the military. And obviously there were economic factors usually at play or often at play, but there were also a lot of really pure aspirations around public service and finding community and, escaping, in many cases, sort of tumultuous past and beyond that, really often sort of a yearning to secure masculine validation. And so it was through those conversations that I started to sort of develop a real interest in military masculinity and come to sort of understand how profound the military's influence on American masculinity has been.
Well, that's really awesome. And to do that investigation, and I'm as a disabled veteran and someone who uses these services and who's been in the military and has my own journey as to why I joined, I can see and very much understand this ideal of masculinity from the military and like this strive for that ideal, at least in the military view of masculinity. Can you go into some of the things that you found while you were talking with folks, while you were interviewing veterans? What were some of the what were some of the most tangible lessons that you got out of all of these interviews? That and what was this picture of an ideal that you saw that many may have coalesced around, even if they didn't realize it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think one thing that struck me pretty early on is how there is in this country sort of a dearth of opportunities, especially for men, to sort of, chase their dreams and find meaning. I mean, the military, as is often said, is a real reflection of, this country's population at large, which is one of its major strengths. Um, but it also points to the fact that, boys for a long time have had few options for public service or to sort of, work through themselves and find an identity. I mean, um, in writing about military education specifically, I saw that, on one end of the spectrum, valedictorians are frequently recruited into the sort of most elite service academies like West Point and Annapolis. And then, at the opposite end of the spectrum, there are these sort of like troubled teen adjacent military schools for bad apples and troubled boys, kids dealing with behavioral issues, learning disabilities, who got caught up in the juvenile justice system. So really, so from one end to the other, boys are often prescribed military service. And so that to me felt like something worth interrogating. And at the same time, boys from all walks of life coalesced generally around, a similar set of ideals, which on paper are very aspirational and I think worth striving for. They're also sort of impossibly vague. And the military, I think, doesn't flesh them out often because to do so would often sort of point out the hypocrisies and the tensions inherent in military service. But, I mean, to me, having spoken to hundreds of vets, cadets, active duty folks over the years, I have found no one no sort of single constituency as purely and deeply dedicated to this country's ideals as vets and service members. Oftentimes their sort of optimism and aspirations can curdle once they've been through the system and seen the sort of realities on the ground. But I think that many people join the military often as children at a very young age, motivated to, sort of give back to their country, to engage in public service, to fight for democracy, to test their own strength and own drive, to build in positive habits, to find structure, to find family. I mean, there are lots of very understandable and aspirational ideas that unite people into joining. And the problem often is that once they enter, rather than finding like a strong, sustainable identity, the military sort of often, and I found forever, withholds true validation, true love, true support, because it needs to sort of motivate action and behavior and sort of create a sense often of sort of like anxiety and striving. I mean, the hierarchy itself, I think, does a really good job of illustrating these tensions. You can always sort of get another rank, secure another medal, and it forever feels like the the masculine archetype is just out of reach. And so that really doesn't I mean, many people like deeply embrace their military identity. It becomes who they are and will forever be. But even those folks, I think, and maybe especially them, I mean, Pete Hegseth is a good example, are kind of cursed in some ways by feeling insufficient, feeling like they haven't sort of met these really impossible ideals around, strength, courage, and service.
Is in all of that, there's a lot to digest there, and it rings really true. Is one I was enlisted. I have family members who are officers. I know folks all across the spectrum from the military services. Did you find any difference in the approach between officers and enlisted when they were reaching for this ideal, or how they saw themselves in this lens of masculinity? And like, what if there are differences between those two passions towards striving to that ideal? What types of differences were they, and why do you what did you get from the veterans on why they saw them?
Yeah, well, I think that generally, and this isn't always true, of course, but to me, enlisted folks tend to have a far more balanced view of themselves than officers. They are able to often maintain core parts of their identity pre-service and maintain, honestly, like a certain humility around their service. It is not everything to them. Often they are enlisting for more practical reasons out of economic necessity. And officers, by contrast, generally come from more privileged economic backgrounds and are seeking in a more sort of intense way um, status, really. You know, they want high rank, they want to be recognized, they want to be, great men of history. And, as part of that, they are exposed in an intense way to military ideology. I mean, everybody who enters the military, you know, um, is inculcated with a certain dose of military education through boot camp and sort of other trainings. But this is generally a few weeks, whereas if you're at West Point, this is a system you are exposed to for 4 years. And in that process, as I argue in the book, um, you know, there tends to accompany a sort of certain level of isolation from civilian life and a certain sense of superiority over, civilians and enlisted. I mean, it also, there are also just really punishing dynamics, intense hazing, um, and sort of, semi indoctrinational cultish behaviors and traditions that all cadets are exposed to.
I like how you said semi in there. I don't know if that was entirely necessary for a word, because there's a lot of mythologizing and indoctrination in the military in various ways, and you kind of have to be able to. You have to indoctrinate someone on some level to get them to want to go put themselves in harm's way and fight for their nation. Like, that's not the normal path that most people follow. Just interrupting there for a second. I
No,
wanted
I
to.
appreciate it. I think you're right. I'm trying to be diplomatic, but I
Oh,
would
you don't
agree.
have to be diplomatic here. We are not always diplomatic in our thoughts. Because I wanted to ask, like, while you were touching on this in terms of like the West Point, I was in the Army, so I West Point to me is very much more familiar than some of the other academies. Is like, with that indoctrination, was there, and I know, and I partially know the answer to this question already, or probably know a bit of the answer to this question already that I'm going to ask, is we have this mythology in America, and we mythologize certain people in our nation's history, from George Washington to Dwight D. Eisenhower to other military leaders that we have had. How have you seen that impact the direction that some of these men take? And maybe let's use some modern examples like Pete Hegseth, because he's our secretary of wannabes right now, and he is acting like a huge wannabe, and he wants to be a mythologized figure. How do you see that playing into, from your investigations, how do you see that playing into like the role through history to now and what we could see coming.
Yeah, well, the great men of West Point were imperfect figures, no doubt, and could be fearsome and brutal and, you know, uh, unnecessarily violent, of course. But they embraced an old school conception of service and manhood that, at least on paper, had a certain nobility to it. And I think critical to the World War One and Two generation was a certain humility and a certain willingness to reckon with failure and to embrace accountability. And these are things that are crucial to any functioning institution. Um, I think, for instance, to Eisenhower's famous farewell address as president, warning about the buildup of the military industrial complex. This was followed a year later by MacArthur's farewell address at West Point, in which he sketched out a ideal soldier as one who was humble, who didn't take themselves too seriously, who embraced humor. I mean, there was a certain sense of strength that these men exuded, but they were also willing to be vulnerable about the military losses they suffered, the human loss of war, and what that meant to them and how that impacted them. And they kept up the idea of the soldier as ultimately subservient to the civilian. They embraced these old school ideas that the founders impressed upon the nation to never elevate the soldier above the citizen. And so because of that, I think that the young men they reared, maintained some of these virtues in real and honest ways. But I mean, these speeches from Eisenhower and MacArthur happened in 61 and 62. And from there, we enter the Vietnam War and things really curdle quite quickly. William Westmoreland, a West Pointer, um, prosecutes Vietnam on a pretty brutal kill count strategy. And the sort of ideology shifts to one in which soldiers are expected to be brutal and violent and rack up body counts. This is also, the first time we see the elevation of the special operator to the sort of position of classic male military archetype. And that has remained pretty prevalent and sort of become even more so in the global war on terror, as evident by, the explosion of books and movies and TV shows about SEAL Team 6, the Osama bin Laden raid, etc. And from there, you sort of get someone like Pete Hegseth, who eschews accountability entirely, who builds, a revisionist history around the global war on terror that, rejects reckoning, that blames the losses on women and people of color. And so, I mean, really, I sort of see Vietnam as the crucial turning point that really, sours any sort of aspirational ideas contained within military walls.
I absolutely see that. The hypermasculinity of the hypermasculine archetype that we express onto our operators and our special forces teams is really toxic. It's the Rangers have it in the army too. There's a very toxic line of we're better than everybody else, and we are. And yes, you sort of need it as a service member. You do need to see yourself in a certain light so that you know you're going to win. Like you're going to win the fight because we're better. We're more well trained. We're more well armed. We're more well equipped. We're more everything. And so there is, again, it goes back to that indoctrination, I think, too, is there's this indoctrination level. You have to do it. You don't have to do it. I think we made it so we had to do it, or we felt we had to do it that way to see ourselves above. And you made an interesting point in there around the not seeing service members, not seeing themselves above civilians, and embodying that ideal. How do you see that now in the way that it's influenced, say, movements of white nationalism or other types of more really toxic masculinity post service where they, because I know you've spoken to Chris Goldsmith before, and one of the things he talks about a lot is mission, is the drive for mission and belonging, and that camaraderie that you get in the military. But once you leave, it's often not there, and certain groups pick up on it and use that to their advantage. How do you see that playing on both ends from pre-service? So, like in schools, because you mentioned both military academies, but also military schools for quote bad kids, and how that's played out to lead into a more toxic in service, and then that drive that is missing post service, getting sort of sucked into these more extreme groups.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that today there is just so much um, atomization, isolation, feelings of despair that permeate, men. And the military offers a community, a place to sort of satiate all of these worries, this dysfunction. And, being in the military can feel very heady and very motivating. And the problem is that there are few civilian alternatives for this sort of work. And so then inevitably, especially over the last half century or so, what happens is men get kicked out of the military. They have been highly trained on violent tactics and also highly motivated to win a mission. And what has happened really is that many of them have left the military feeling like they have not accomplished a mission, that the mission was bungled, that it was rotten, that it was, misdirected. And so they still have that really deep yearning to accomplish something, to secure, victory. And inevitably, those urges are weaponized and leveraged by often white nationalist movements and militias. Um, and, many men flood into those movements because there are few other alternatives. And because, frankly, military ideologies often rhyme with white nationalist ones. I mean, the title of my book, God Forgives, Brothers Don't, is evidence of this. God Forgives, Brothers Don't was the West Point football motto for many years up until 2019, when it was discovered that initially God Forgives, Brothers Don't was the Omerta Code of the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas, a brutal neo-Nazi prison gang. That same year, it was discovered that West Point's science building featured a bronze plaque featuring a hooded man and the words Ku Klux Klan. So, there's also just a deep history of coordination, sort of latent coordination, and sort of, uh, really a pipeline between the military and white nationalist movements. So, I mean, that is evident again by January 6th. I think it was like, 230 of the rioters initially charged had a military background. So, I mean, we will inevitably continue to see military veterans become enmeshed in these movements unless we both improve our abilities to assist in transition efforts between active duty service and civilian life. And a key part of that is, fortifying public service in other ways. This is as simple as, you know, uh, supporting the VA with more monies and ensuring that, many veterans continue to have the opportunity to serve in the VA as clinicians or support staff. I mean, a third of the VA right now is veterans, and many of them sort of feel that continued mission, helping fellow vets in a productive way. I mean, this is not destructive, this is productive. This is sort of the ideal of what military vets should do post service. Many of them join the post office and do vital public service there. So there are avenues, but they can be strengthened, and new ones should be established in order to divert vets from these more toxic paths.
I like that you're focusing on the idea of service after service, because that's a big thing for a lot of veterans, and defining service and what that actually can mean. Is I see service too as an extension, not only the ones that you have listed as post office and the VA, but also becoming a teacher, becoming a local member of your city council or your school board or what have you. Like, learning that service can continue in various ways, and providing a mission that is more than just service as military. How do you see that playing out with what you've investigated and what you've learned? How did you see that playing out in terms of like the military schools for children and like delinquents? I'll use air quotes on that because many were probably sent there because their parents were failures and not so much that the kids themselves were failures. But what do you see as like that impression being maybe different from, because I know a lot of kids who go into these military schools don't actually end up going into service. They just see themselves as like Donald Trump. He has a picture of himself staring at himself from when he was in military school. And someone posted, find yourself a man that looks at you the way that Donald Trump looks at himself when he was in military school. Like, what what do you see as that having a component in like this toxic masculine archetype even before people get into the military? And
Yeah,
how do you see
absolutely.
that playing out, say, in our schools more broadly too?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, you know, one of the profound failures of public education, which, to be clear, is an incredible system that is under grave attack, produces incredible outcomes, but, from its beginning has struggled to deal with students with challenges, whether those are, disabilities of some sort or sort of tumultuous home lives that end up in sort of troublesome behavior in the classroom, rather than embrace these sorts of unruly students, these lost boys, rather than sort of surge resources and specialized supports for them. Often what happens is they are funneled into other places. And historically, one of the major repositories has been these sort of military style reform schools. Um, Donald Trump went there, J.D. Salinger went there, many sort of notable figures, and many more who, we don't know about. But what this sort of demonstrates to me is that, yes, even if you are not directly entering the military, and many of these sort of, military style schools offered a commissioning program, but it wasn't required. But what this shows is that there's this deep belief that you can apply a military ideology of sort of breaking someone down and building them back up, and that will sort of it's this universal sort of, panacea formula that can reform boys and make them into good men. But the problem is what you are doing ultimately is, schooling them in a culture of violence and subjugation and power. I mean, there are certain noble elements in there, like community and camaraderie and love and support, certain level of sacrifice. But again, this has all sort of helped instantiate a culture where even if you are a civilian, you sort of feel some pull to aspire to, classic military virtues. And, this sort of, these lessons are, trickled down through many interesting sort of avenues that I explore in the book, one of which are PE teachers. Strangely enough, physical education teachers really had no purchase in the early 20th century. They were not in many public schools, but they sort of made a deal with military leaders who pushed them into public education. And sort of as part of that, PE teachers sort of adopted a sort of militaristic culture in public schools, and often pushed for compulsory military education and compulsory military training in public schools. Military figures were also critical in, instilling practices of giving the Pledge of Allegiance every morning, and, like design textbooks that emphasized great military men of history, and sort of that pushed the idea of sort of military campaigns and battles as the sort of crucial linchpins of Western history. So there are all of these like subtle cultural ideas that help fortify this overall sense for, civilians, young boys, that they need to sort of maintain a hyper aggressive attitude, and that they need to sort of, be domineering in their lives and stoic. And so this plays out in all sorts of ways, not only in the military, but in police departments, in ICE, in sort of just domestic dynamics and patriarchy. This is really sort of pretty widespread throughout American society.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that, especially like we get military recruiters in high schools. We um we we don't shy away from the violence, and we encourage the violence or the hierarchy structure. Um that's a great question from the chat is, do you feel that the plight of young men or boys is actually being addressed in any way? Um, and then I'll follow up. I have some other I have some other questions for you after that. But what are your thoughts on how you see this being addressed, or do you see this being swept under the rug, encouraged? What do you see going on for young men right now with this type of behavior?
Yeah, well, I think one of the trickiest virtues that is both heralded in military and civilian environments as crucial for men is the idea of sacrifice. And, to some extent, I can see the virtues of sacrifice in certain applications, like any man who, takes on burdens to support his family and his loved ones, and, is willing to endure some level of suffering or inconvenience or whatever else as an act of love. I can see the purity in that. I can see the beauty in that. But taken to its extreme, or sort of its inevitable conclusion, which it often is this feeling of, you know, real devaluing, self-devaluing. I mean, if sort of ultimately how you see yourself in society as a man, as your best role, as one in which you sort of have to die in order to sort of like fully, prove your mettle and your manliness, that is what you are needed for, is to just sort of like die on the sword. That can really create deep sort of psychic hangups and struggles, and again can be incredibly devaluing. I think that There are certain facets of military culture that can be fortifying. I think really, I mean, when I speak to vets, to a person, what they will generally say is, I was ultimately never swayed or seized, and this is slightly different depending on officers or enlisted, but for the most part, it's to these men not about the sort of abstract mission, whether it's spreading democracy or securing trade routes or whatever else. At the end of the day, what gives these men meaning is the brotherhood that they secure. And depending on the unit, this can be a really beautiful thing or it can be pretty toxic and punishing. But at its best, I think what the military offers is a place for men and women, ideally people from all backgrounds, to work together around a shared mission. And there's a strange permission structure in the military because it is sort of considered so macho and hyper aggressive, where it actually can sometimes open up space for more vulnerability and like pure acts of love. And men can nurture those feelings in really beneficial ways and then keep those bonds into civilian life. So I think the military can offer that at its best, is a journey for men to sort of find a community that can often feel difficult in civilian life. But at the same time, I think there are all of these other ideas foisted upon them that are sold as like fulfilling and fortifying, but at the end of the day are not that. And really, the military at the end of the day is not an institution designed to validate men. It is one that is focused on manpower and recruitment and securing tactical aims. It is a very cold mission. It is not a warm one. And so it should never be expected that this institution will actually solve man's ills. That is not what it is designed for, and that is never what it has done.
I think that's a really good way to put it, is the institution itself is not meant to promote non non-mission driven value and non tactical and strategic value. There is a lot of good that can come out from service and has come out of service. And I want to make sure that for those in the audience too, is none of this is an attack on the service itself and what you can get out of it. It's understanding the what drives and what's caused some of these and many of these issues. And yeah, we have a friend in the chat, EG. Thank you for that a wonderful comment you made. Was, and I want to get your thoughts on this, Jasper. Is EG says, I worked at a university tissue bank and I was the only non-veteran. They treated the employees much better than in civilian lead workspaces. They were very careful not to overwork anyone and had tremendous respect for the women working there. They seem to be tired of the hierarchy and aggression. Another officer veteran friend has a PhD in physical therapy, and he speaks out against workplace harassment. How do you see that balancing some of the more toxic traits, and why do you think, in your opinion, many of us, and I won't say some, I think many of us come out of the service wanting to take those systems apart and make them better? Why do you think there's such a dichotomy on those coming out of the service? Because it's really one or the other. Like, you either go down the rabbit hole of extremism, or you're really fed up with all the bullshit and you're like, we have to fix this. Why do you see that as a dichotomy, and what do you see may have caused that?
Yeah, well, I think everyone who enters the service is exposed to the same lofty ideals around integrity and accountability and meritocracy. And, I mean, no institution holds itself to a higher standard than the US military. On paper, this is a place that has no room for corruption, for illegality, for non-gentlemanly behavior, really. I mean, so part of military culture historically has been the idea of, the gentleman soldier who is also just like day to day humble and supportive and respectful, and there
That's actually going to cut in real quick. That's actually a standard that officers are required to follow too. Is there are standards of behavior that they're supposed to follow in and out of uniform, and one of them is to be gentlemanly as a man or ladylike as a woman, whatever that means, or anywhere in between. But there are strict standards that they're supposed to follow. Sorry to cut
Right.
in
I
that.
mean, I believe the Uniform Code of Military Justice outlaws infidelity. So if you're in the military and you cheat on your spouse, that can be grounds for termination.
Yes.
Um,
Yes, it
so,
can.
again, like very high standards. And I think a lot of people who enter the military deeply truly commit to those virtues. And that's a major part of the reason that they are there in the first place, whether it's because they have found, day to day in their civilian life, people who live cynically and who, retaliated against them in work or whatever else, they sort of move into the military because they're hoping for something better. And what often happens is once they are exposed to the reality, and, which, the military, like every other institution, is not perfect, of corruption and cronyism and, a good old boys network and a hierarchy that can be easily exploited, and a uniform code of military justice that can be unevenly applied, in which, some are spared from punishment and others are unfairly retaliated and targeted. They can speak out against that system. They can harbor real resentment towards it. They can work in their own subtle ways to sort of try and protect the people in their units and secure their futures. And that is all really impressive and difficult. And again, many sort of stay committed to those values throughout, even if they find people at the top, violating them. Or what they can see is a hierarchy and a military structure in which, that frankly promotes yes men and people who keep secrets well. I mean, this is very evident in West Point and its alumni association. I mean, this is sort of a cartel of power, the ring knockers, as they're often known, who look out for each other, and they prioritize loyalty to themselves and their cliques and the army rather than loyalty to the country. And so people can go that way and engage in corrupt behavior and sort of brush aside true military ideas in order for their own careers. And those are the people generally, often, unfortunately, though not always, who stay in the military for a long time and are in plum positions. You have to, even if you maintain certain integrity, no one gets to the Joint Chiefs of Staff without, a little bit of blood on their hands. And so I think a lot of people emerge from that system, yes, cynical, but also still committed to those ideas and really focused on changing things for the better.
I like that explanation and the dichotomy that you were able to establish for us there, and get us. I wanted to ask. There's been some good questions in the chat. In terms of like sexual assault, harassment, the more violent tendencies that come out. How do you see all of this playing a role in creating or maintaining that culture, compared to what it should be? Because if we were actually following the ideals of being a gentleman, being a lady, being a well put together anybody, you wouldn't do that to others. You wouldn't harm someone in that way. Yet we see it a lot in the military. And we talk a lot about men on male on female or other violence, but we often glance over the male on male violence that is especially sexual violence in the military. Um, can you talk about, was there, in your interviews, was there any, like, and your investigation throughout this, was there a link to that and why those types of behaviors come out? Um, and I know obviously it's a hypermasculine system and it's not meant to promote stability and growth in men. You already talked about that. Is the point of the military isn't to make men better, it's to fit into a system and to work in that system. But how do you see all of that playing into, like, the rates of assault and how maybe that hierarchical structure creates a drive almost to encourage that behavior?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, my book tracks, you know, the violent re-socialization rights that have permeated the military dating back to the country's founding. Also looks at how fraternity hazing and military hazing are that their histories are deeply intertwined. And I think really it comes back to this cold military calculation to sort of break someone down and then build them up. I mean, the truth of the matter is that many young people who enter the military already have a really good head on their shoulders. They have a value system, they have ethics, these sorts of intense, you know, indoctrination systems are not required and frankly often offend sort of basic ideas around morality. Um, but I think, there is this warped idea that has permeated the US military for a long time that intense stress and the sort of need to cultivate violence are prerequisites for any good officer, any good soldier. I mean, certainly you need to develop battlefield skills, but there's been a lot of really interesting research actually about how hazing and sort of intense stress induced POW interrogation camps and things like that these young cadets are exposed to are completely ineffective at actually preparing someone for battle. They just instill trauma, anxiety, stress. They fray at social bonds. So they are not actually accomplishing what the military wishes. I mean, I think, sort of hanging over all of this is the fact that the people at military schools, as with, often drill sergeants and other people in training capacities, they themselves have endured this trauma, both in training and also on the battlefield much of the time. And so there is sort of this warped sense of love and protection where they think, okay, well, I have been through all of this stuff. I have experienced a lot. And so I must now expose these young people to these same sorts of traumas because that will protect them. That will keep them safe in battle. So I can sort of understand to some degree why this system is rationalized. But, ultimately at the end of the day, the best thing that a military can hope for is cohesion. And as you've noted, I mean, this system that promotes violence, both as a form of punishment and one of bonding, ultimately spins out of control and leads to a lot of military sexual violence against women and men. And that just completely fractures cohesion, creates, a service in which many people want out as soon as their commitments are over. I mean, it's really hurting the force in a pretty profound way. And yet the brass is so stubbornly attached to these ideas that time and again they sort of make public pronouncements outlawing hazing or saying that military sexual trauma is a top priority, only to sort of let these behaviors continue to fester.
I think that's a really interesting look at it on the it is passing on the traumas, but it's this idea that they're not breaking the trauma of the past to make something better, um, or more stable or stronger. How has this all impacted your view on your own masculinity and what you want to see for yourself as a man who would want to strive towards something that's not this toxic masculinity, but more, as we call it, intelligent masculinity? What is this all this these interviews, the writing the book, reflecting on all of it? How has it helped shape your own view of yourself?
Yeah, well, I have a very sort of unique backstory in that, whereas many boys growing up who enter these systems or don't are, like the sons of battle drained vets or, hard boiled colonels. My father, by contrast, was deeply involved in the anti-war movement during Vietnam. I mean, he was sort of like a classic hippie, and became deeply enmeshed in the movement, was mentored by Howard Zinn and collaborated with John Lennon and members of the Chicago Seven. He was actually able, in this brief moment, to sort of partake in this alternative form of masculinity, that was completely the opposite of the military. And that's, I think, part of the reason why the Pentagon was so nervous during the anti-war movement, is because they worried that, the peacenik could supplant the soldier as sort of an aspirational archetype, and all of a sudden their, recruitment efforts would really suffer. So my father, steeped me in a very different world than a lot of people, a lot of young boys are exposed to, whether they come from a military lineage or not. Um, he talked a lot about the war and the corruption underlying it. He, promoted peace and love as core virtues. And I mean, nonetheless, I myself still found a certain romantic pull towards the military. I mean, I never seriously considered enlisting or going to West Point or anything like that, but still in my bones, I could feel this sort of tug of like wanting to feel strong and be a badass and, protect the country and all of the rest. But because of this grounding, very thankfully, I was able to develop an alternative form of masculinity that, while imperfect, certainly, allowed for, I think, vulnerability and emotionality and things that have really helped me and allowed me to dream and be myself and reflect and do all of these things. I mean, there's a certain, perhaps the like most poignant quote during this book writing process came from John Wheeler, an old West Point graduate, who talked very simply about how his time in the Army was oriented around the idea of things worth dying for, big notions that are worth sacrifice, sort of getting back to what we were saying, which he later in life compared to the sort of more feminine coded idea of things worth living for. And I think that's like a really helpful dichotomy here, is just, living a life oriented around destruction versus living one oriented around creation. And I think that, and that wasn't totally clear to me growing up, but I think over the course of writing this book, I became more committed sort of consciously to the idea of that, of sort of trying to push forward the virtues of creation rather than destruction.
I really like that way to talk about it, is creation versus destruction. You mentioned something there, and we're right at the top of the hour, but I don't want to keep you too long over. But I want to get your thoughts on this. Was you mentioned legacy, and many of us who join the service, myself included, have a legacy of military in our family. My dad was in the service. My grandfathers were both in the service. My brothers are in the service. My cousins are in the service. My like my wife was in the service, my sister-in-law, like there, it's a rich history and legacy of being in the service. And I never wanted to join at first. I did it. One of my driving reasons was because I did not want to get stuck back at home. I wanted to be able to get out and have a future. And that was even after going to school and college, and I still enlisted. I just wanted to have something that was mine, that I could latch on to and make my own. Is how do you see that legacy factor playing in some of this, in these discussions? Did you notice that there were greater tendencies towards either the creative or the destructive side, depending on if somebody had a legacy of military in their family, compared to, say, someone who is rather new to it because they needed to get out of an economic situation? It was either that or jail or what have you, whatever their reason was, that wasn't so much legacy bound. Did you see a difference in how people responded to these systems?
Yeah, that's a really good question. As I think it through, I think that, the legacy element could go one of two ways. I mean, I have a whole chapter on the first women who attended West Point in the mid 70s and the sort of pretty traumatic and tumultuous experience they had. Many of them entered West Point because they came from military families and they had fathers who had very high expectations of their strength and their service, and they wanted to feel validation from their fathers. And so, certainly in some cases, I think there is that really intense pressure, that intense family pressure to keep that lineage alive. But at the same time, I spoke to many people who, entered West Point or the military during the Vietnam era, for instance, and had come from a military family. And the stories that they had heard from their ancestors contrasted so greatly from what they were seeing. They had entered because the military that they knew had some, valuable sort of and real virtues at the core, and had, fought and waged war for ethical, morally solid reasons. And so when they entered a conflict that felt rotten to the core, many of them rebelled against that, were vocal about trying to bring back a culture of integrity. And so I think, and then sort of like the final sort of complicating thing is many of them were aware of, acutely aware of the strains and struggles that military service creates. And they had a very, there was perhaps a certain romance to how they viewed the military, but they also were relatively clear-eyed about how things operated. And I think that history, that knowledge really grounded those folks and allowed them to work the system in a way that in which they were able to maintain their own personal peace and integrity and try to sort of work to push the system, in ways that felt manageable in a positive direction.
I appreciate that. That's a there's it's led to some questions in the chat too around, like, did it make a difference if it was, say, talking about veterans who their lineage goes back to World War II versus, say, those, or even the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, versus those who maybe only have family history back to, say, Vietnam or Desert Storm, or even at this point, uh, the global war on terror and the Afghan and Iraq war. Like, there were fathers and sons, there were moms and daughters, there was a generation that went into war and then they left it for their children who then picked it up. Do you see like a difference in view depending on like how far back that lineage goes to compare for comparative service? Because I know, like, folks who have parents who were in the Vietnam War have a very different opinion on the military and how the government treated their parents and the service members compared to those who were in World War II or even some of the more recent wars. Like, does that play? And from the sound of it for you, is your dad was on the opposite end of that, but was still an integral part of what the Vietnam War was and how that shaped our perceptions. Do you see that as being? Did you see that as being maybe a factor in some of these tendencies for the men?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and again, like things can go one of two ways, but I've spoken to countless Vietnam vets, including those who were drafted and those who enlisted, who swore that they would do anything in their power to ensure their kids never joined the military. Whether they joined because they believed in the mission initially or not, they just saw so much wrong in how the military operated that they made it their cause to keep their sons and daughters safe from that culture. I mean, the stark reality is that post Vietnam, after the draft was abolished, under Reagan, the U.S. military developed a very targeted recruitment campaign focused in rural, conservative, often religious communities. And so the sort of stark truth is just that those sorts of people and those families became sort of ever more important as part of the military's recruiting calculus. I mean, that was another huge part. It's like if you can see a father or mother who served, find the son and daughter and really recruit them hard. So those families have just seen a lot more attention from the military's recruitment figures. And so that I think has something to do with it. But the other thing, I mean, I think there is a sense of real pride that can tip into cynicism and resentment in a lot of these communities where like they take pride that these, in the GWAT generation, for instance, like that a father and a son are serving together. And partly that is an outgrowth of the fact that often they are in communities where there are very few economic alternatives. So this is the place to go if you want to go to college, if you want a path into a middle class. And so a father will, support his son or daughter in that work because of that fact alone. But at the same time, because of this deep divide between elite, more urban places and rural, conservative ones when it comes to military service, I just think that these places really do have a real pride because the burden of war fighting and service is really so much on their shoulders. They have had to endure so much. They have seen so much loss in their communities. And out of that, I think, emerges a culture of service that is really deep and intense and difficult to navigate away from.
I appreciate that. I appreciate the answer, and I appreciate this discussion today. And I'd love to have you back for more because I think we have a lot more we could talk about, especially on your book and how it shaped you, but also what we can do moving forward. Because we weren't able to get to that part of this discussion, Daria. That's a great question: is how will that damage the future? And I think that would be a great start to another conversation with Jasper and I. Is how is this damaging our present and our future, and what do we do to change it, and how do we get into changing it? Because that's our focus, that's my focus, is how do we better this situation, how do we get out of this toxic cycle of destruction and move to one that is of creation and of promotion of life. And Jasper, I'd love to have you back for another discussion, to be able to dig further into that. But as we close out here, is how do people find you? How do people support your work, and what you're doing? And I'm going to switch over to your QR code that I've got for Substack. But how do people support you, and what you're doing now? Where can people find your book? What's the best way to help your work?
Yeah, well, folks can follow me on Substack, where I write frequently and plug my work in various magazines and national news outlets. Please do buy the book, God Forgives, Brothers Don't: The Long March of Military Education or the Making of American Manhood, available at your local indie or bookshop.org or Amazon, or your local library. And yeah, I really appreciate the conversation, and I would love to do another one.
Thanks, Jasper. And I'm glad to have had you on this morning, and I'm glad we were able to get this to work today. Everyone, thank you for being in the audience with us today. Thank you for your wonderful questions and being a part of the discussion as always. I really appreciate the community that we have here who want to ask questions and be involved in this discussion. It makes it so much more stimulating and brings out some really great conversation points. So thank you all. Thank you, Jasper, for joining me today. And please, everyone, go subscribe to Jasper, go buy his book. I dropped a link for it directly from the publisher, from Simon and Schuster. If you want to, I will also add the link for everyone when I do put the post show notes out. I know I'm a little bit behind on some of the intelligent masculinity shows coming out, but I'll have updates with all of those coming out. But Jasper's will have his book link in there too. Please go support the work that Jasper's doing. For me, this was an incredible discussion this morning and a great way to spend the day. As my dog bells go off, as the doorbell rings, is thank you, everyone, for being here today. Thank you for joining us. I'm Nick Paro, joined by Jasper Craven on Sick of This Shit Publications, and this has been Intelligent Masculinity today. Thank you, everyone. Jasper, thanks so much for joining me.
My pleasure.